On the evening of April 11, 1981, the quiet mountain town of Keddie, California seemed like the kind of place where nothing could go wrong. Nestled deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Keddie wasn't much more than a collection of cabins, dirt roads, and pine trees. It was the kind of town where neighbors knew each other by name, and families left doors unlocked because danger always seemed like something that belonged to the outside world. But by the next morning, Keddie would be at the center of one of the most brutal and haunting unsolved crimes in American history. A case so disturbing that even decades later, people still whisper about it, and theories still divide true crime communities around the world. This was the night of the Keddie Cabin Murders. Before we continue, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every crime holds a story, and every mystery begs for an answer. Your theory might just shed new light on what really happened that night. It began in Cabin 28, a modest rental property in the Keddie Resort, where 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp lived with her children. Sue had moved to Keddie the year before after separating from her husband. She wanted a fresh start, a safe place to raise her family. Her children ranged in age from 5 to 15, and life in the small cabin was far from easy, but Sue did her best. She took classes at the local community college, leaned on welfare to make ends meet, and tried to provide her kids with stability. Despite financial struggles, she was known as a loving, protective mother who wanted the best for her children. On that Saturday evening, things at Cabin 28 seemed fairly normal. Sue's daughter, 14-year-old Sheila, had arranged to spend the night at a friend's house just down the road. That decision would save her life. Back at the cabin, Sue was at home with her 12-year-old daughter Tina, her 10-year-old son Rick, and her 5-year-old son Greg. Also in the house were Sue's 15-year-old son John and his 16-year-old friend Dana Wingate, who were staying over for the night. It was a crowded little cabin, but the Sharps were used to that. The evening passed quietly. John and Dana had spent part of the day in Quincy, the nearby town, hitchhiking back to Keddie when the sun began to set. The boys had planned to hang out, maybe listen to music, maybe just talk the way teenage boys do when they're restless and looking for some excitement in a place where not much ever happens. Inside Cabin 28, no one had any idea that they were being watched. Some neighbors later recalled seeing strange people around the cabins in the days leading up to the murders. Unfamiliar faces, vehicles that didn't quite belong, men who seemed out of place in the quiet family resort. But no one thought much of it at the time. After all, Keddie wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. It was supposed to be safe. At some point during the night, while the youngest boys slept soundly in a back bedroom, terror crept into Cabin 28. What happened inside would leave investigators horrified and baffled. In the morning, when Sheila returned home from her friend's house, she opened the door to a nightmare that would scar her forever. The living room was soaked in blood. On the floor lay the bodies of her mother, Sue Sharp, her brother John, and John's friend Dana. They had been brutally beaten and stabbed, tied with medical tape and electrical cords, left in positions that suggested unimaginable violence had unfolded. Sue lay on her side, partially covered by a blanket, gagged with her own underwear and medical tape wrapped around her head. She had been bludgeoned with a hammer and stabbed repeatedly. John and Dana had been tied with electrical cords and beaten so savagely that their injuries were almost unrecognizable. Dana appeared to have been strangled as well. Blood was everywhere, splattered on the walls, soaked into the carpet, smeared across the furniture. The scene was chaotic, frenzied, and merciless. But as horrifying as it was, the discovery came with an even darker twist. Sheila ran through the house in a panic, expecting the worst for all her siblings. And yet, in one of the bedrooms, she found her two youngest brothers, Rick and Greg, along with their friend Justin, completely unharmed. The three boys had slept through the entire massacre just feet away from where their family members were slaughtered. None of them had been touched. None of them had even woken up. It was as though the killers had deliberately spared them, or simply hadn't cared to look into the room where they slept. But one person was missing. Tina, the 12-year-old daughter, was gone. Her bed was empty, her shoes were left behind, and there was no trace of her anywhere in the cabin. Panic swept through Sheila as she realized that not only had she just discovered the bodies of her mother, brother, and his friend, but her younger sister had vanished without a trace. When police arrived, they were faced with one of the most gruesome crime scenes they had ever seen. The brutality shocked even seasoned investigators. Multiple weapons had been used, including at least one hammer, a knife, and possibly other objects. The walls bore marks of the struggle. The bindings used on the victims suggested sadistic control, and the overkill made it clear this was not a simple robbery or random act. Whoever had done this, or whoever they were, they had rage. The first responders were immediately overwhelmed. The crime scene was chaotic, and in the early hours, mistakes were made. The cabin was not secured properly. People came and went, contaminating evidence. Neighbors wandered close to the scene. Even members of the family were allowed inside before investigators fully grasped the magnitude of what they were dealing with. These errors would haunt the case for decades, making it harder and harder to piece together what had really happened that night. Meanwhile, the missing girl, Tina, became the focal point of immediate concern. Had she been abducted? Was she still alive somewhere? Or had she been taken only to meet the same fate as her mother and brother? For years, that question would linger without an answer. It would not be until 1984, 3 years later, that Tina's remains would be found, 50 miles away in the woods, scattered and skeletal, her life cut short in ways no one could fully explain. As the small community of Keddie processed the horror, rumors spread like wildfire. Who could have done such a thing? Was it someone from outside the town, a drifter passing through, or was it someone much closer? A neighbor, a friend, someone they saw every day? The sheer savagery of the murders suggested deep anger or twisted motives. But why the Sharp family? Why spare the youngest children but destroy the others? Why abduct Tina? Investigators began digging into Sue's life, searching for enemies. Some pointed to her estranged husband, but he was quickly ruled out by distance and lack of evidence. Others whispered about men she may have turned down romantically, or men who may have harassed her. Theories multiplied, but nothing solid stuck. The cabin, the bindings, the multiple weapons, it all seemed too personal, too deliberate to have been random. The murders of Cabin 28 shook Keddie to its core. Parents no longer felt safe letting their children wander. People locked their doors for the first time. Everyone looked at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the killer was one of them. And in a town that small, everyone knew everyone else. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, no arrests were made. Clues existed, but they didn't seem to add up. Witnesses gave conflicting statements, and the silence around Tina's disappearance weighed heavily on the entire community. The Sharp family had been shattered, and the case that should have galvanized law enforcement into swift action instead seemed to crawl, stalled by missteps and mismanagement. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became chillingly clear. The answers might not just lie with strangers, but with people who had been close to the family, people who had spent time in Cabin 28, people who had reasons, however twisted, to destroy the lives inside that small home. And yet, every time investigators thought they were close to the truth, it seemed to slip away again, leaving behind only more questions. What investigators didn't know at that moment was that a pair of suspects were already in plain sight. Men who had been around the cabin, men who were known to the family, men whose names would come up again and again as the years went on. But the deeper the search went, the more dangerous it became to dig into the truth of Cabin 28. So the question remains, who walked into that cabin, and why did they choose that family? If you think you know, drop your theory in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. In Part 2, we'll uncover the suspects whose names would haunt this case, and the chilling witness accounts that suggest the killers were closer than anyone wanted to believe. The investigation into the Keddie Cabin murders began under the weight of shock and confusion. Sheriff Doug Thomas and his deputies were tasked with making sense of the brutality inside Cabin 28, but from the very beginning, the case was plagued by mistakes. The scene had been compromised almost immediately. Evidence was trampled, fingerprints were smudged, and potential witnesses wandered in and out before order could be established. For a crime so violent and chaotic, precision was needed. Instead, the first critical hours were marked by disarray, a reality that would come back to haunt investigators again and again. As law enforcement sifted through the horror, they began piecing together what little they could from the wreckage. The bindings on the victims told them something about control. Sue, John, and Dana had been tied up, suggesting that at least one of the killers wanted dominance over them. The tape and cords were common, but the way they were applied revealed something chilling. This wasn't sloppy, spur-of-the-moment violence. This was deliberate. Someone had taken the time to restrain their victims before unleashing brutality. The weapons used also spoke volumes. A hammer and a knife were confirmed, but investigators suspected more than one hammer and perhaps multiple knives. Blood stains suggested movement during the attack, bodies being repositioned, and a struggle that had gone on for a considerable length of time. The scene was loud, violent, and prolonged. Yet somehow the three boys in the back bedroom had slept through it all. That detail puzzled police. How could so much chaos unfold without waking them? Some speculated they had been drugged, but toxicology would never confirm it. Others suggested the killers intentionally left them alive as witnesses too young to fully comprehend what had happened. From the very beginning, one name kept surfacing: Justin Smart. He was the young boy who had slept through the killings in the back bedroom, a friend of Rick and Greg. But unlike the Sharp children, Justin wasn't just anyone. He was the stepson of a man named Martin Smart, a local resident who lived only a few cabins away, and Martin's name would soon become central to the investigation. In the days after the murders, Justin gave conflicting statements about what he might have seen or dreamed that night. In one account, he claimed he had been awake and witnessed parts of the crime from behind a door. He described men in the cabin, one of them with long hair, another with short hair and glasses. He spoke of weapons being used, of Sue being attacked, and of Tina being taken out the back door. His stories wavered between memory and imagination, but they were unsettling. If true, they suggested the killers hadn't been strangers at all, but men he recognized, men from Keddie itself. Meanwhile, law enforcement began to look closely at Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather. Martin lived in cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn. On the surface, he was a regular man in the community, but behind closed doors, his marriage was troubled. Marilyn would later describe Martin as abusive and controlling, a man whose temper could explode. On the night of the murders, Martin and a friend named John, Bo Bubaid, had been out together. Bo was a drifter with a questionable past who had recently moved in with the Smarts. The two men were seen at the local bar that evening, and their whereabouts during the critical hours of the murder were far from clear. What made matters worse was the strange behavior Martin exhibited in the days after the crime. He told people conflicting stories about what he had been doing that night. He admitted to leaving the bar, but his timeline shifted depending on who he spoke to. He also made cryptic comments, once allegedly telling a therapist that he had a problem with Sue Sharp and had wanted to see her gone. He claimed she had interfered in his marriage, advising Marilyn to leave him. If that was true, then Martin may have held a personal grudge. As investigators pressed, Marilyn herself provided chilling details. She revealed that Martin had given away a hammer shortly after the murders, a hammer that matched the description of one believed to have been used in the killings. Years later, in 2016, that very hammer would be recovered in a nearby pond, buried in mud and rust, strengthening suspicions that Martin had discarded a weapon used in the attack. But back in 1981, with evidence mishandled and leads not fully followed, nothing conclusive tied Martin or Bo to the scene. Both men were questioned, but they were never arrested. Sheriff Thomas himself seemed reluctant to push too hard, and some later accused him of being too close to the suspects. It is said that Martin had connections with the sheriff, and that those ties may have clouded the investigation. Meanwhile, Sheila, the surviving daughter who had discovered the bodies, lived with trauma and unanswered questions. She knew her family, and she knew the dynamics of the small community. She couldn't shake the feeling that the killers were close, maybe even neighbors. That thought haunted her, especially as rumors spread that Martin and Bo were at the center of whispers. Yet no charges were brought against them. The town itself began to fracture under suspicion. Some people believed the killers were outsiders, transient men who had come through and unleashed violence before vanishing. Others were convinced it had been locals, people everyone saw every day. The brutality of the murders suggested passion and rage, not random opportunism. Why else target Sue, her children, and their friend? Why else abduct Tina? Forensic evidence in 1981 was limited. DNA analysis as we know it today didn't exist. Investigators relied heavily on witness testimony, physical evidence like blood type, and shoe prints. At the scene, they had found multiple blood types, suggesting more than one killer. There were shoe prints of different sizes, but much of the evidence was either mishandled or lost in the chaos. Over time, files went missing, photos were misplaced, and critical pieces of information simply vanished. To this day, many people believe the investigation was sabotaged, whether by incompetence or by design. As for Justin's testimony, it became increasingly bizarre. In hypnotic regression sessions conducted by police, Justin described details that seemed eerily specific. He spoke of Tina being led out of the cabin. He mentioned the weapons. He even hinted at recognizing the attackers. But hypnosis was controversial and unreliable, and critics later dismissed his statements as planted or confused. Still, the image of Tina being dragged into the night lingered like a ghost over the case. For the Sharp family, grief turned into a desperate plea for answers. Relatives demanded accountability. They wanted to know why 3 people had been butchered and why a child had been taken, yet no one was behind bars. The silence of law enforcement fueled conspiracy theories. Some believed the killers had been protected, either by personal connections or by darker reasons tied to corruption. Others wondered if the sheer brutality of the murders had scared investigators into inaction, fearing that pursuing the truth too aggressively would have consequences. And then, 3 years later, the case took another chilling turn. In 1984, a man discovered fragments of a human skull and jawbone in the woods of Butte County, some 50 miles away from Keddie. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Tina Sharp. Alongside the bones were other small items, but the cause of death could not be determined. Tina had been missing for 3 years, and now her fate was sealed in the most devastating way. But why had she been taken? Was she abducted as a witness to be silenced? Was she the intended target all along? Or was she subjected to something even more horrifying in those missing years? No one knew, and the discovery only deepened the darkness surrounding the case. By then, suspicion of Martin Smart and Bo had only grown. Rumors swirled that both men had left town shortly after the murders, moving away and starting new lives. Marilyn, Martin's wife, divorced him not long after, citing his abusive behavior. Years later, she would state openly that she believed her ex-husband and Bo had been responsible for the murders in Cabin 28. To her, it wasn't even a question. But without hard evidence, her words were just another haunting echo in a case built on shadows. Theories multiplied, each one darker than the last. Some suggested drugs were involved, that Sue or John had stumbled upon a local drug operation, and that the murders had been a cover-up. Others claimed it was a crime of passion, that Martin's anger towards Sue had boiled over, and he had enlisted Bo's help to carry it out. There were even whispers of law enforcement complicity, that certain officials knew more than they admitted, and that's why the investigation had been allowed to wither away. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility was that multiple people in Keddie knew what had happened and chose to remain silent. In a town so small, secrets were hard to keep. And yet, the silence around Cabin 28 was deafening. Decades later, new investigators would pick up the case, finding overlooked evidence and recovering old files. DNA testing on tape bindings would yield results pointing to living suspects. But back in 1981, none of that existed. All the Sharp family had was grief, rumors, and an ever-growing fear that justice might never come. The story of Cabin 28 wasn't just about murder. It was about the collapse of trust in a community, the failure of a system meant to protect, and the shadow of 2 men who seemed to hover over the case yet walk away untouched. As the years passed, Sheila carried the weight of what she had seen. Justin grew up under the cloud of suspicion tied to his stepfather. Marilyn lived with the belief that her husband had been involved in one of the worst crimes imaginable. And the residents of Keddie whispered about what had happened that night. Some convinced they knew the truth. Others resigned to the idea that the truth would never be spoken aloud. What really happened inside Cabin 28? Was it Martin and Beau, fueled by anger, hatred, or perhaps something more sinister? Or was the truth hidden even deeper, involving people with the power to bury evidence and silence voices? Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and drop your theory in the comments. Was this a crime of passion, a cover-up, or something even darker? Next, we'll follow the trail of evidence that emerged years later: the recovered hammer, the shocking confessions, and the DNA discoveries that point directly at the killers. But even with the evidence in hand, the Keddie Cabin Murders would remain one of the most chilling unsolved cases in American history. The years after the Keddie Cabin Murders dragged on like a heavy shadow over Plumas County. Time moved forward, but the pain never left. For Sheila Sharp, life became about survival in the aftermath of tragedy. For the community, it became about whispers and speculation, a lingering wound that no one could close. And for investigators, it was a puzzle that seemed to resist every attempt to fit the pieces together. As months turned into years, the case grew colder, and yet the details refused to fade. People remembered the hammer that Martin Smart had so casually discarded. They remembered the cryptic comments he made, the tension in his marriage, and the presence of his friend Beau, whose criminal past and sudden appearance in Keddie raised eyebrows from the beginning. But without the tools of modern forensics, the case remained locked in limbo, waiting for science and persistence to catch up. One of the most damning pieces of information came from Martin Smart himself. At some point after the murders, he allegedly confessed to a counselor at the Veterans Administration that he had killed Sue Sharp. He claimed it was because she had been interfering in his marriage, urging Marilyn to leave him. According to the counselor, Martin also said that Tina had been taken so there would be no witnesses. These admissions were documented, yet somehow never fully pursued by law enforcement at the time. It was one of many baffling failures that plagued the investigation. Even more haunting was the hammer. In 2016, decades after the murders, a hammer matching the description of the one Martin had discarded was recovered in a local pond near Keddie. Rusted and corroded, it had lain there for years, silent but damning. Modern investigators believed it to be one of the weapons used in Cabin 28, corroborating Marilyn's long-held claim that her ex-husband had disposed of it after the murders. It was physical proof that could no longer be ignored. DNA evidence also began to breathe new life into the case. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to test old evidence from the crime scene, including tape used to bind the victims. The results pointed to living suspects, individuals still out there, still walking free. Although names were not immediately released, the implication was clear. Those who committed the Keddie Cabin Murders had not vanished into the night. They were known. They were identifiable. And yet, they had never faced justice. For those who had long suspected Martin and Beau, this confirmation felt both validating and infuriating. Why had the case been allowed to languish for so long when so many signs pointed to the same men? Marilyn, in later interviews, stated that she had no doubt her ex-husband was responsible, and that Beau had helped him. She remembered details that seemed trivial at the time but chilling in hindsight: the way Martin burned clothes in their fireplace shortly after the murders, the way he had acted strangely, the way he seemed almost relieved when she finally left him. To Marilyn, the truth was clear, but the system had failed to act. As the decades rolled on, the Keddie murders became something larger than just a local tragedy. They became a case study in how justice can be derailed by incompetence, by corruption, by fear. Files went missing. Evidence was lost. Leads were ignored. Some even speculated that law enforcement had deliberately avoided pressing too hard because of connections to Martin, or because of larger criminal networks that might have been exposed if the truth came out. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. 3 people brutally murdered, a child abducted and killed, and no one held accountable. The town of Keddie itself faded in significance over time. The resort cabins fell into disrepair, and the once idyllic getaway spot became a place marked by infamy. Cabin 28, where the murders had occurred, stood for years as a grim reminder. Locals avoided it. Curious visitors whispered about it. True crime enthusiasts made pilgrimages to see the place where the unimaginable had happened. But for the Sharp family, it was not a tourist attraction. It was the place where their lives had been shattered. Eventually, the cabin was demolished, but the memories could not be erased with wood and nails. For survivors like Sheila, the pain of that night never lessened. She grew up with the trauma of having found her family's bodies, of losing her sister Tina, of knowing that justice had never been served. In interviews, she spoke about the weight she carried, the unanswered questions, the frustration of knowing that names had been spoken aloud for decades and still nothing had been done. Hers was a life marked by loss, defined by a night that stole everything she knew of family and safety. The Keddie case also drew in journalists, authors, and armchair detectives who pored over the details, trying to make sense of the madness. Some pointed to Martin and Beau as the only logical culprits. Others argued for broader theories involving drugs, organized crime, or even law enforcement cover-ups. The crime scene's brutality suggested rage, but the abduction of Tina suggested calculation. It was this combination, raw violence and cold strategy, that made the case so haunting. Whoever had done it hadn't just lashed out in a fit of anger. They had taken the time to tie their victims, to silence them, and to remove a child who might identify them. That level of control hinted at experience, perhaps even practice. There were moments when the case seemed on the verge of breakthrough. New investigators in the 2000s publicly declared that they knew who was responsible and that arrests would come. They spoke about the DNA evidence, the hammer, the confessions. They gave hope to those who had waited decades for closure. But the arrests never materialized. For reasons never fully explained, the Keddie murders remain officially unsolved, even as the evidence mounts in plain sight. In the end, what makes the case so chilling is not just the brutality of the crime, but the silence that followed. A silence that stretched across decades, across families, across generations. A silence that suggests not only the killers knew what had happened, but that others did too and chose not to speak. In a small town like Keddie, secrets are hard to keep, and yet, somehow, this secret has survived for over 40 years. For many, the Keddie Cabin Murders are more than a crime story. They are a reminder of how fragile justice can be, how quickly it can slip away when evidence is lost, when officials look the other way, when those with power refuse to act. It is a story of a family destroyed, of a community scarred, of killers who may have lived out the rest of their lives free, knowing they had silenced not just voices, but truth itself. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the killers were Martin and Beau? Or do you think the truth lies in something bigger? A cover-up, a conspiracy, or a network of silence that went beyond two men in a cabin? Finally, we'll step into the chilling final pieces of this puzzle. The overlooked confessions, the DNA tests that pointed directly at the killers, and why, despite everything, justice never came for Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. The question isn't just who killed them, it's why the truth was buried for so long, and who benefited from keeping it that way. The Keddie Cabin Murders were brutal, but the true horror might not be in the killings themselves. It might be in the decades of silence that followed. Silence from those who should have spoken. Silence from those who should have acted. Silence that has allowed the murders of Sue Sharp, her son John, his friend Dana, and young Tina to remain unsolved for more than 40 years. And as we step deeper into the final threads of this case, the question becomes not only who committed the murders, but why has the truth been kept hidden? Back in 1981, the investigation was shaky from the start. Critical evidence was mishandled, crime scene photos were misfiled, and interviews that might have provided key testimony were never followed up on. A vacuum formed, and in that vacuum, speculation grew. Over time, as more details trickled out, suspicions fell squarely on Martin Smart and his friend John Beau Bubaid. Martin was a volatile man, prone to anger, with a failing marriage and a history of disturbing behavior. Beau was a drifter with criminal ties and a reputation that stretched far beyond Keddie. Together, the two formed an unsettling pair. Witnesses reported seeing them on the night of the murders. Marilyn, Martin's wife at the time, later recalled details that seemed impossible to ignore. The burning of clothing, the missing hammer, the sudden shift in Martin's demeanor after the killings. The most damning piece, however, came in the form of a confession. Sometime after the murders, Martin Smart reportedly admitted to a counselor at the Veterans Administration that he had killed Sue Sharp. His reasoning, according to the counselor, was chilling. He said Sue had interfered in his marriage, urging Marilyn to leave him. In Martin's eyes, Sue had crossed a line. He allegedly also admitted that Tina had been taken so there would be no witnesses. Think about that for a moment. A man openly confessing to killing a mother and explaining the abduction of a child. And yet, that admission was never followed up in any meaningful way. The information was documented, yes, but it went nowhere. No charges, no arrests, no trial. The confession floated in the background of the case, a detail known but never acted upon. Years later, more revelations emerged. Marilyn herself gave interviews suggesting she had long believed her ex-husband was guilty. She described how he had destroyed evidence, how he had acted strangely in the aftermath, how Beau's sudden arrival and involvement made everything feel darker. Marilyn even recalled that Martin had told her outright he hated Sue Sharp, blaming her for the breakdown of his marriage. If the confessions and Marilyn's testimony weren't enough, physical evidence later surfaced to back up these claims. In 2016, a hammer was found in a local pond near Keddie. This wasn't just any hammer. It matched the description of the one Martin had once said was missing. Investigators now believe this hammer may well have been one of the murder weapons used inside Cabin 28. For decades, it sat rusting at the bottom of the water, a silent witness to the crime, discarded by the very man long suspected. But even with a confession, a weapon, and multiple witnesses pointing to the same names, the case never moved forward. Why? That's where the whispers of corruption and cover-up begin to dominate the story. Many who have studied the Keddie case believe that Martin Smart may have had protection from higher up. Some theories suggest he was an informant for law enforcement or tied to larger criminal operations in the area. Beau's background adds fuel to this fire. He was reportedly connected to organized crime in Chicago, with rumors linking him to far-reaching networks. If either man had value to law enforcement, it's possible the murders were quietly pushed aside to protect ongoing operations. Adding to the suspicion, critical files related to the case went missing. Evidence was lost. Interviews were misplaced. When new investigators reopened the case decades later, they discovered shocking gaps in the original records. Information that could have tied Martin and Beau more directly to the murders had simply vanished. Was this incompetence? Or was it deliberate? By the 2000s, advances in DNA testing offered a glimmer of hope. Old evidence from the crime scene, including tape and bindings used on the victims, was retested. The results pointed to living suspects. This was a seismic breakthrough. After years of shadows, here was science confirming that those responsible were still alive and identifiable. Investigators even stated publicly that they were close to making arrests. Yet, again, no arrests ever came. The frustration grew. Families of the victims, particularly Sheila Sharp, who had lived with the trauma of that night for her entire life, demanded answers. Sheila spoke openly about the pain of losing her mother, her brother, her sister, and her friend, about the horror of finding the bodies, about the unanswered questions that haunted her for decades. She wanted closure, but closure remained out of reach. The case began attracting media attention again. Documentaries were produced, articles written, podcasts recorded. The public became fascinated by the eerie combination of brutality, incompetence, and conspiracy. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, building timelines, analyzing suspects, connecting dots the authorities seemed unwilling to connect. And always, the same names rose to the surface: Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid. Marilyn's testimony only added weight to the theory. She stated repeatedly that she believed Martin and Beau had killed Sue and the others. She described Martin's hatred for Sue, his volatility, his confession to the counselor, his disposal of evidence. She recalled how Beau had been living with them at the time, how his presence had changed the atmosphere in the home. Everything pointed in the same direction. And yet, for all the evidence, for all the confessions, for all the advancements in forensics, the Keddie Cabin murders remain officially unsolved. The killers, if still alive, have never been brought to justice. The case stands as one of the most infamous examples of justice denied in American history. What does that say about the system? Was it simple incompetence that allowed the killers to walk free? Or was there something more sinister, deliberate suppression of the truth, a decision made by people in power to protect their own interests no matter the cost? Even today, those questions linger. Modern investigators have stated publicly that they know who did it, that the evidence is clear, that the case could be solved. But words are not justice. Until someone is arrested, until a trial is held, until the families are given closure, the Keddie murders remain a scar on the promise of justice. The image of Cabin 28 has become symbolic. For years, it stood rotting in Keddie, a grim monument to the violence that occurred inside. It attracted curious onlookers, journalists, and true crime fans, all drawn to the place where horror had lived. Eventually, the cabin was demolished, but tearing down the wood and nails did nothing to erase the memories. The land itself seems to hold the weight of what happened there, a silence that is louder than words. For Sheila, for her surviving siblings, for the families of John, Dana, and Tina, the wound never healed. Their lives were permanently altered by a night of violence and a lifetime of unanswered questions. They continue to speak, to push for answers, to ensure the story is not forgotten. And in their persistence, they remind us of the human cost of unsolved crime. This is the story of the Keddie Cabin murders, a story of brutality, of silence, of evidence ignored and justice denied. It is a reminder that sometimes the most frightening part of a murder is not the crime itself, but the decades that follow, when truth is buried and killers walk free. Before we close, ask yourself this. Do you believe Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid were the killers, shielded by incompetence or corruption? Or do you think there's more, a larger conspiracy, a network of silence that stretched far beyond two men in a cabin? Drop your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery we uncover. Because the Keddie case may be officially unsolved, but the hunt for answers is far from over. And as long as people are still asking questions, there's a chance the silence might one day break.